And welcome to Go Your Way. I'm Greg Neerman, once again, joined by Phoebe Go. And Phoebe, one of our most prolific relationships inside of NetApp is our relationship with Microsoft Azure. And it's one of the
Prolific.
areas, is it prolific the right word?
We have a prolific friendship, Greg.
Okay, maybe prolific's not the right word. Anyway, we've got a fantastic relationship with Microsoft Azure. And it's a kind of a focal point of conversation because obviously with any of the public cloud services, it obviously part of this series is around data protection. A big element of that value that we're driving with Azure, particularly with Azure NetApp Files, is the full suite and features of managing your data.
Yeah, it's a really fun conversation to have because I think I look at the public cloud providers, look at Azure and their entire suite and their portfolio of services, of which they just announced, even more at all their latest events. And you think, okay, well, where's the value that partners like NetApp bring to the Microsoft ecosystem? And I think it's a really fun conversation to have. I think it's great for thinking about how we can help our customers succeed better together. So
Absolutely. And joining us today is Principal Technologist at NetApp, Kirk Ryan, who also happens to be a Microsoft Azure MVP. Kirk, we're not worthy.
Hey everyone, nice to be here.
So, Kirk, what? Just clarify. What is a Microsoft MVP?
So for anyone that doesn't know, an MVP is a Microsoft. So it's a Microsoft Most Valued Professional. So it's voted for by community leads, other MVPs, and your peers, and it's rewarded for excellence in giving to the community. So whether that's sharing technical articles, showing people how to do things, coaching, mentoring, there's a really wide series of MVPs, and my MVPs in Azure specifically.
Yeah, and we know that how much you've given to the community. So I'm glad that you're here for our community as well on Go Your Way.
Absolutely. And Kirk, obviously, we all work together very closely. And I think one of the things that I've personally learned from you is obviously all the value added features with Azure. And particularly, I mentioned the partnership, the prolific partnership between NetApp and Microsoft Azure.
Prolific.
But as we get like more specific into this from a data protection perspective, all clouds aren't created equal. And so there's different levels of services, different levels of value. And there's also the parts of simplicity and ease of use and being able to execute pretty quickly. But let's focus in on that data protection element. What makes Microsoft Azure stand out in this respect?
Well, I think Microsoft have really sort of developed a lot around data protection. The problem, though, with Azure is there's so many different aspects to it. Some people, when you mention data protection, will automatically assume around infrastructure, others around services. It's quite hard to really totally understand the data protection landscape within Azure because there's just so many services within there. What makes Microsoft stand out, though, is that in general, the data protection capabilities that you get, they're there in the first place. So they're enough to make sure that you are backing up your data and that you can do so most of the time in a managed sort of way as well. And you'll hear a little bit more about that with how we help them do that in future as well. But really, yeah, that's kind of the key thing I've seen is Microsoft have covered a lot of the bases. It's just harder to know, making sure on your service, is it available for what you're looking for? And also, does it fit your requirements as well? Because, of course, backup's the easiest bit, but it's really the restore capabilities that you should be looking into. Do they meet your KPIs for and SLAs for backup and restore?
So I have a question about Azure in particular, and you've worked with the cloud provider for quite a long time now, and I think a couple of the cloud providers too. Do you think that Microsoft has approached the concept of data protection and backup differently? Or do you think it's top of mind when they're creating a new service, or do you think it's something that they still leave to the end customer, the consumer, to make sure that they're considering when they're implementing a cloud strategy on Azure?
Well, A lot of people mistakenly think it's on by default, and that's not really the case. So if you take, for example, something like Office, for example, there's a real concept that a lot of people might not be familiar with, which is around shared responsibility. If you look at the model of what Microsoft provide and what they're responsible for, it pretty much takes you all the way up until the data. The data is yours. So they state that explicitly, that it's your data. We don't own your data. Therefore, you are responsible for the backup and restore of your own data. And that having that line of demarcation of responsibility, it's a shared responsibility model that many people may not be used to because they've just assumed that it's part of the service. So, for example, Microsoft aren't responsible for making sure that your files in Office 365 are backed up. And a lot of the time as well, some people won't realize because things like they do a good job of doing a lot of soft delete functionality. So recycle bins hidden away, and they do that with their blob containers, for example. You can enable that sort of stuff. But again, it's not a backup strategy. That's kind of like soft delete functionality. And it's really hard. I think it's getting more difficult for end users to really know what is a backup, and they must have a clear definition. And to share with everyone on here, my clear definition of what a backup is over the 10 years I've been at NetApp now is an independent copy of your data that is restorable in any location, regardless of the status of the source system. That to me pretty much clearly defines a backup and what you'd be looking for as a business in terms of restore capability as well.
Kirk, I'm curious, we've talked in the past about Microsoft Azure's well-architected framework, and you're also talking here about shared responsibility. Is there a link between those? Is a good backup and recovery strategy part of a well-architected framework, or is that independent of it?
Well, they go hand in hand. I mean, obviously, you need to be well architected from the off to make sure that you've got a supported model. You'd be surprised how many people will go and deploy something and then even just go for the simplest support. And because it's not in a supported model, it can become either very costly to go and repair your error and make sure that is then pushed in a supported model. Or some vendors may outright turn around and say, sorry, that's not supported. And that's it, you're stuck. You have to engage very costly third-party services. What the framework helps you do is make sure that, this is a tried, tested, and it's got many sort of field hours behind it of ensuring that this is something that is well supported, because there's no magic behind the covers. People forget that, it's not like Azure has magically invented some new physics or anything. It's ensuring that under the covers that you're selecting the right compute racks, that they're going to be highly available, that if that rack does fail, and things do fail, and people have to get used to build for failure in the cloud. And that's what the well-architected framework helps you achieve, is you are building for failure. It's totally alien at first to go from the last 15 years where almost every RFP, and Phoebe, you will know this as well, where it's always been we need 5 nines minimum before we even let you in the door. to now it's like, 4 nines, 3 nines, yeah, that's acceptable because it's a different operating model and everything. So there are risks, of course, to that, and you just have to be aware of them. I don't think anybody gets in a bad place on purpose. I think they just don't necessarily understand where the weakest link in the architecture is, because there can be multiple layers, especially when building infrastructure as a service.
I like that. Yeah, backup is also, to your great definition earlier about backup being an independent copy, I think it's a really great point to also say that backup is when your weakest link fails, when you really need to recover from that point. So I have a question though, for some of the people in the audience maybe not so familiar with Azure, and I thought this too when I first saw it. They have a service called Azure Backup, right? What does Azure Backup actually back up?
So, it's pretty much focused on your infrastructure more than anything else. So your virtual machines, the disks, those sort of things. What a lot of what gets lost sometimes is this assumption that, okay, well, I've put my application on that virtual machine or the instance, whatever you want to call it these days. The problem is it still doesn't get over that challenge of the difference between them. So that's just one thing to be aware of in terms of, is it infrastructure, is it application, those sort of things as well. But I think, yeah, again, you still have that responsibility for the data within that particular infrastructure piece as well, and that is your responsibility.
So,
But we
Kirk,
should
we've
talk
been
about that
talking
data.
about tools that are native inside of Azure. And in addition to being native inside of Azure, we've got a service called Azure NetApp Files. Well, it's not our service, it's Azure's service. It's a first-party service. So how does Azure NetApp Files a part of this equation when we think about data protection?
Okay, so I'm going to be clear to anyone watching this, and I can't say this enough, having been on the ANF team from the very start. Azure NetApp Files is a first-party Microsoft service, right? So it's not actually sold by NetApp. Do you know we can't even quote it? It's not in our books. It's a Microsoft first-party service.
We know that.
Well, you know that, right? Do you know that? Well, hopefully. Now you do. But the greatest thing about it is that means there's no separate procurement process. Anybody who is using Azure, especially an enterprise customer, is generally authorized to use Azure first-party services. So that gives you a tremendous head start in showing off this technology to everyone. But there are other advantages outside of that. So, for example, if you think with ANF, if it's a first-party service, that means you get all the advantages of you're natively integrated into the portal. You're natively integrated into the billing. You know, it's not a separate bill. It's not a separate support agreement. You are natively supported by Microsoft. Just go in the support, click, I have a problem, and it's handled by Microsoft support. So from a user perspective, it's seamless. It's the same as a virtual machine, a virtual disk, a blob container, whatever it is in Azure, there is no difference. And that puts us at a tremendous advantage because there is nobody else that has that level of integration in the world. So I think that's a really key thing to do with. On the other side of things, obviously, infrastructure is pretty useless unless you can fit it into your existing processes. So with it being native, of course, it comes with some native backup and restore capabilities. So no third-party requirement there. So you can manage your snapshots. I wrote one of the original snapshot schedulers that you can still get today if you need it, but it's evolved. So you now have this inbuilt snapshot scheduling capability to make sure that your data is backed up and, if needed, moved between regions as well. And it does it extremely efficiently too. So again, no third-party integration, no third-party network plumbing required. It is just built into the service. And that is a huge advantage of Azure NetApp Files. And you can't underestimate that at all. It has been critical to many of the wins that I had with ANF, some of the larger customers across the globe.
So a question though about Azure NetApp Files in particular provides, file services within Azure, native file services in the Azure for NFS and SMB protocol. But again, that's talking about provisioning applications on top of that, or applications accessing that data. In your experience, Kirk, and in speaking with customers about the infrastructure versus application backup, can you walk us through that? What do we need to think about that's different? What should we be aware of? And what are some people, where does people get caught out when it comes to application backups in Azure?
So I love that question because you can tell that's come from experience.
Pain.
That pain is on your face right now of knowing the difference between a backup and a backup, if that makes sense. So let's drill into it. Okay, so no, not all backups are created equally. You really got to think about what is the data you're backing up, and are you even backing up correctly? So case in point, let's look at something that is critical to most businesses, a database. So that's probably going to be something like a SQL, an Oracle, even an SAP HANA database, for example, something that, your business lives, breathes, and runs on this every day. This is what is powering a lot of your revenue streams. And that is not something you can just say, yes, we've got snapshots and everything's backed up. Shock, horror, everyone pause the tape. You can't do that. If you take an in-flight snapshot of pretty much anything, that all you're going to do is end up with what's called an inconsistent application snapshot. that means there is absolutely no guarantee that you'll ever be able to restore from that snapshot. So you are like hitting and hoping that that thing works. And sometimes you get lucky, sometimes, most of the time not. It's not a viable backup strategy. I don't recommend you propose that to anyone that is serious about their databases.
Okay. So let's go back a step. We're talking about how Azure Network Files has inbuilt capabilities to run these snapshots on schedule. But when it comes to databases and applications, they're not necessarily the only thing that you need to make sure that you're going to be able to restore from that backup. Okay, so when is a snapshot usable as a backup?
Okay, so let's really break it down simply. So you can look at some of the work, and let's use an example to really illustrate it. Probably the worst named thing, but I always think it just rolls off the tongue, right? ASIC Snap. Which
who named that?
Who named that? Anyway, okay. So ASIC Snap, that is there for application consistency. So for anyone that doesn't really know what is the concept of application consistency, let me just take 60 seconds to really dive into this. If you're going to back up something like, let's take the databases I spoke about earlier. Really simply, you need to tell that database, hey, listen, get ready for a backup. Get yourself in a consistent state. So just like taking a family photo, hey, everyone, get in, look good. This photo is going to last forever, sort of thing. This is going to be my memory. That's the best way of thinking of a snapshot, because if you take it and everyone's running around, it's not a great snapshot at all. Right? People might be out the frame and everything else. Apply that to a database. You've probably got lots of transactions going on at any one time. If you take those and they're in flight, some might be in memory, some might be hit, there is absolutely no guarantee that what you're capturing on the data layer even correlates to the actual application itself, because it may have stuff in memory, in paging files, and so on. So it's really important that as a differentiator, you look into this and go, we can offer through a lot of the integrations that we've got either with third-party vendors or with Microsoft themselves, the capability of talking to your mission-critical applications and making sure that that restore is a viable restore, because we talk to the application as well. And that's really important.
Yeah, I think that ecosystem integration is really important, and understanding what those applications are, and having that background with SAP and with Oracle and with, all of those providers, I think is really critical. So a question for you though, Kirk, I'm going to lift this up right out of the weeds. We were getting a little bit into the weeds. We talked before this call just about, what is the total cost of ownership of backup? It's not just, being able to provision tapes anymore, or paying some guy to sit in the tape library swapping them out. There's a much different kind of set of variables in the TCO. So could you talk through some of that, in particular with the cloud provider like Azure?
Yeah, sure. So again, you've got different tiers of everything. So if we just home in on one piece, so we look at the storage layer, for example, you've got, in the simplest way, you've got things like SSDs, things that are more priced like hard drives. So they're obviously cheaper. And then you get into this new tier that you may not have had on-prem before, which is sort of object storage, which excels at putting data in, especially backup. And then within that tier, you have even colder tiers that get cheaper and cheaper. But if you look on the graph of, well, there's the cost and it's getting cheaper and cheaper per gigabyte, the time or the speed starts to decrease as well. So you don't get as much speed, and the time increases as well if you need to get things back. So in many cases, some of the coldest tiers, you may be waiting hours or even days for that data to come back. And I think that's the hidden cost of cost optimization. Sometimes you can take it too far. And the worst case scenario many customers may get themselves into is they've had so much pressure from above of keep the costs down, let's make sure we're cost optimized, that they haven't thought about, okay, well, the data is stored, that's fine. But what happens when your business is offline and you need to get that data back? It's coming from the slowest part of the architecture as well. So that's where there's not one size all fits all. So with ANF, you probably want to keep a rolling window of, let's say, at least the last 48 hours rolling window. And that is really where 99.9% of your this business is on fire restores are going to come from. Out of that, you may have, we need to look at a table from a week ago. There's something suspicious, or somebody from a different department was doing something. We need to get that for the auditors. that's where it makes sense, because those things aren't as time critical. So it's really important for people to understand how fast do we need to recover. I'm really getting down to that, because that's a hidden cost that must be included in the TCO as well. Of, well, if we're down for 2 days, what's the cost of that? And I think a lot of people forget that. What is the cost of doing something versus what is the cost of not doing something as well?
Well, and another question, just another question there. You know, you're talking about restoring from backups maybe taking hours, if not days or longer. How do you test backups in Azure? What are your recommendations to customers?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, there's multiple methods, again, depending on what your architecture is, but let's just take ANF and zoom in on that. One of the easiest ways and flexible ways is going to be the clones. So you can create copies of the data that mean that you don't actually have to invoke full-blown DR. Now, for any NetAppers watching this, this is not an alien concept. We've been doing this for many years, very successfully on-prem. However, in the cloud, this is brand new. We've reinvented the same light bulb from like 2009, and we're loving that moment again. And this is an absolute game changer for many people that, especially SAP HANA, for example, that have to do restores quite regularly. This can save them days, if not weeks, and a lot of manual overhead in ensuring that their business can survive, you know, the worst disasters as well.
This has been fantastic, Kirk, and some wonderful information, seeds for us to kind of process, particularly around that testing, because I think that's one of the things that we see over and over again in these conversations, is that challenge and kind of that mandate within teams that are managing these applications and managing the infrastructure as a service, to be mindful of that testing. So thank you so much, Kirk. Kirk, I know how to track you down, but how would you recommend folks in the audience tracking you down?
Hey, it's not hard. You can find me pretty much anywhere. So I'm on Twitter. Oh, hang on, that way. Twitter, LinkedIn, and you can pretty much see me at a lot of user groups. So if you are in the UK, or if you're fortunate enough to be at one of the main events, I'll probably bump into you there. But yeah, I'm not hard. So just over here is probably the best way.
And if you can't tell, that's a double underscore in Kirk's Twitter handle.
How dare someone nick my name? Yeah,
you've got one there for redundancy, right?
Yeah,
you have too many underscores. Thank you very much, Kirk, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kirk.
And Phoebe, we're hearing some consistent themes here across this whole data protection series. And I think Kirk validated a lot of things. I look at a well-architected framework. I look at best practices, how to really think about the total cost of ownership. And again, reiterating the point and the importance of testing.
Yeah, I think we should stop calling this data protection and call this, business continuity or data recovery, because at the end of the day, protection is just one step in that process. And it's probably the easiest if you look at it. It's actually all the other parts around it that are really important for our customers. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in the concepts that we talk about with all the hyperscalers or even with our partners, check out the rest of the series of Go Your Way podcast videos on data protection.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And please, like Phoebe said, be sure to watch the rest of this series. Thank you.
Thank you.